In the spring of 1928, a Pike County courthouse clerk filed a document listing Ruth Kincaid, age 12, as transferred household labor to a family 30 miles deeper into the mountains. What officials recorded as domestic arrangement was actually a transaction that stripped a child of everything. Before we dive into the story, click the like button and subscribe to the channel so you never miss these spine-chilling revelations. And after you've subscribed, write in the comments where you're watching from and what brought you here today. Whether this finds you during your morning routine, afternoon break, or late-night deep dive, you're joining thousands of brave souls who choose to face the darkness of our past together. Now, let's continue with the story. The document sat in a filing cabinet for 55 years before a graduate student researching Appalachian labor practices discovered it tucked between property deeds and timber contracts. The entry, dated April 14, 1928, bore 3 signatures. The first belonged to Hiram Spurlock, proprietor of a remote trading post in the eastern Kentucky mountains. The second came from Edith Spurlock, his wife. The third signature, shaky and hesitant, read simply, Opal Pruitt, mother. Ruth Kincaid had become a transaction. The Spurlock family operated their trading post in a valley so isolated that neighboring homesteads measured distance in hours of walking rather than miles. County records showed the Spurlocks had lived there since 1892, when Hiram's grandfather established the post to serve scattered mining camps and timber operations. By 1928, the operation had passed to Hiram and Edith, a childless couple who managed inventory, extended credit to mountain families, and kept meticulous records of every exchange that crossed their counter. Those records, preserved through a historical society donation in 1976, revealed the true nature of the arrangement. Ruth Kincaid was listed not as adopted daughter or ward, but as household labor obtained through contract. The terms specified that she would reside with the Spurlock family, provide domestic services as required, and receive board, clothing, and moral instruction in exchange. Her mother, Opal Pruitt, would receive quarterly payments of $12, plus periodic allotments of flour, salt, kerosene, and other staples from the trading post inventory. $12 every 3 months, $48 per year. That was the price Opal Pruitt had placed on her daughter's childhood. The contract contained no provisions for Ruth's education, no specifications about the nature or duration of her labor, and no termination date. Most tellingly, it included a clause stating that Ruth would accept the Spurlock surname for the duration of her residence, and that all correspondence with her previous family shall be conducted through the Spurlocks as appropriate. Ruth Kincaid was being erased. Contemporary newspaper accounts from the Prestonsburg Herald mentioned the Spurlock trading post only twice during this period. The first reference, from November 1927, noted that Hiram Spurlock had purchased a new freight wagon to improve deliveries to isolated homesteads. The second, dated January 1929, announced that the Spurlocks had welcomed a young assistant to help manage the expanding household operations. No name was given. No age was mentioned. Ruth had already become invisible in the public record, reduced to an anonymous helper in someone else's story. But Ruth Kincaid remembered. In diaries discovered after her death in 1983, she wrote with painful clarity about the spring morning when her mother told her to pack her belongings. She remembered the wagon ride into deeper mountains, watching her home disappear behind ridge lines. She remembered arriving at the Spurlock place and understanding, with the terrible wisdom children possess, that she was not a guest or even a servant. She was property her mother had sold. Blackberry Hollow earned its name from the dense thickets of wild berries that choked the narrow valley bottom each summer. The Kincaid family had worked 47 acres there since 1893, when Ruth's grandfather claimed the land through a timber company settlement. By 1926, when Ruth turned 10, the homestead consisted of a 2-room cabin, a failing vegetable garden, and 3 dairy cows that provided the family's only reliable income. Ruth's father, Daniel Kincaid, worked the coal seam that ran beneath Cooperton Mountain, walking 6 miles each way to reach the mine entrance. Pike County records show he perished on September 23, 1926, when a support beam collapsed in shaft number 4. He was 31 years old. The mining company paid his widow $87 in settlement, an amount calculated at roughly 2 months of Daniel's wages. Opal Kincaid suddenly found herself alone with 2 daughters in a hollow that swallowed families whole during lean winters. Ruth's younger sister, Ada, was only 6 when their father died. County census records from 1930 show Ada still living in Blackberry Hollow, suggesting she remained with Opal throughout the events that would scatter Ruth to the mountains. The distinction mattered. When Vernon Pruitt began courting Opal that October, barely a month after Daniel's burial, he made clear assessments about which children fit his vision for the household. Vernon operated a timber crew that contracted with lumber companies working the eastern ridges. He owned a 4-mule team, maintained his own sawing equipment, and employed 3 to 5 men depending on the season. By mountain standards, Vernon Pruitt was prosperous. He was also a widower with 3 sons, ages 14, 12, and 9, who needed a woman to manage the domestic sphere, while Vernon focused on timber operations. The marriage occurred on January 7, 1927, in a ceremony witnessed by Vernon's oldest son and the Baptist preacher from Elkhorn. Records show that Vernon moved his 3 boys into the Kincaid cabin that same week, transforming the small dwelling into quarters for 8 people. The arrangement strained immediately. Ruth's diary entries from this period, written years later from memory, describe escalating tensions. Vernon's sons received priority for food portions, sleeping space, and their father's attention. Ada, being younger and quieter, adapted by becoming nearly invisible. Ruth, approaching adolescence and protective of her mother's dwindling resources, found herself in constant conflict with her stepbrothers over territory, chores, and the basic logistics of survival in an overcrowded cabin. By the summer of 1927, Opal was pregnant with twins. The pregnancy complicated everything. Vernon's timber operation required his sons to work the logging sites, but the household still needed tending. Someone had to cook, clean, mind livestock, haul water from the spring, and prepare for the arrival of 2 more mouths to feed. Ruth, at 11, became that someone. But even a hard-working daughter couldn't solve the fundamental mathematics of poverty. 9 people in 2 rooms. Limited income stretched across too many needs. And when Opal gave birth to twin boys in March 1928, the cabin's population reached 11. Vernon Pruitt began making suggestions about alternative arrangements. Later testimony from neighbors would reveal that Vernon had been discussing Ruth's situation with Hiram Spurlock since February 1928. The Trading Post proprietor needed household help. His wife Edith struggled to manage the store while caring for their twin toddlers. Vernon knew the Spurlocks from timber transactions and proposed a solution that would relieve the Kincaid-Pruitt household while providing the Spurlocks with reliable labor. Opal signed the papers 6 weeks after giving birth. Ruth learned of the arrangement 3 days before the wagon came to collect her. The document that formalized Ruth's transfer survived because Hiram Spurlock kept copies of every significant transaction. Filed under household contracts and labor agreements, the papers occupied 3 pages of careful script, each clause designed to legitimize what amounted to the purchase of a child. The agreement's language revealed deliberate construction. Rather than adoption or guardianship, terms that would have triggered county oversight, the document established Ruth as an indentured domestic assistant, bound to the Spurlock household through mutual benefit arrangement. This phrasing exploited a gray area in Kentucky law that allowed families to place children in work situations without formal foster care procedures, provided both parties signed willingly and compensation was exchanged. Opal's signature appeared at the bottom of page 3, dated April 14, 1928. The handwriting wavered, suggesting hesitation, or perhaps simply the hand of someone unaccustomed to signing legal documents. Beside her mark, a witness signature belonged to Vernon Pruitt, who thereby confirmed his wife's authority to contract away her daughter's childhood. The compensation structure was carefully itemized, $12 per quarter, paid at the end of each 3-month period. Monthly deliveries of 20 pounds of flour, 10 pounds of salt pork, 5 pounds of white beans, and 3 gallons of kerosene. Semi-annual provisions of fabric, thread, and other household supplies as determined by the Spurlocks, based on available inventory and market conditions. Calculated annually, Opal would receive approximately $48 in cash, plus goods valued at perhaps $30 more. For this sum, Ruth would provide unlimited labor, surrender her family name, and forfeit any claim to childhood autonomy. The contract specified no holidays, no limitations on working hours, and no requirement that Ruth receive education beyond what the Spurlocks deemed appropriate for their domestic needs. Most damning was the communication clause. All letters Ruth received or sent would pass through Hiram Spurlock's review. Visits from family members required advance approval and would be scheduled at the Spurlock's convenience. These provisions, buried in the middle of page 2, effectively severed Ruth from any support network that might question her treatment or advocate for her return. The contract also addressed Ruth's future. Should she attempt to leave the Spurlock household before reaching 18 years of age, Opal Pruitt would be required to return all compensation received, plus interest calculated at 6% annually. This penalty clause ensured that even if Ruth fled, her mother would have powerful financial incentive to return her to the Spurlocks rather than offer shelter. Legal scholars who later examined the document noted its sophisticated construction. Someone with understanding of contract law had drafted these terms, likely an attorney in Prestonsburg or Pikeville who specialized in commercial transactions. The language protected the Spurlocks from accusations of child exploitation while binding Ruth as effectively as any slave contract from the previous century. Hiram Spurlock paid Vernon Pruitt $5 cash to transport Ruth from Blackberry Hollow to the trading post, a transaction also carefully documented in the ledger. The notation specified, "Delivery charge for household assistant, April 17, 1928. Even the wagon ride that carried Ruth away from her home became an itemized business expense. On the morning of her departure, Opal gave Ruth a canvas bag containing 2 dresses, an extra pair of shoes, undergarments, and a hairbrush that had belonged to Daniel Kincaid. She did not embrace her daughter. She did not cringe. According to Ruth's later recollections, her mother simply said that the arrangement was necessary, that Ada and the twins needed space and resources, and that Ruth should be grateful the Spurlocks were willing to take her at all. Vernon's wagon departed before dawn. Ruth sat in the back beside bundles of freight bound for the trading post. She watched Blackberry Hollow disappear into the morning mist, understanding with terrible clarity that she was not being sent away temporarily. She was being permanently discarded. The Spurlock trading post occupied a valley so remote that the mail carrier made deliveries only on the 1st and 15th of each month, weather permitting. The main building housed both the store and the family's living quarters, a practical arrangement that allowed Hiram to monitor inventory while Edith managed customers. Behind the main structure stood a storage shed, a smokehouse, livestock pens, and a small building that had once served as a bunkhouse for transient workers. Ruth slept in the storage shed. Her quarters consisted of a narrow space between stacked flour barrels and crates of canned goods, barely wide enough for the corn husk mattress Edith provided. A wool blanket offered minimal protection against cold that seeped through gaps in the plank walls. During her first winter there, Ruth woke most mornings to find frost coating the inside of the shed, her breath visible in the darkness before dawn. The daily routine began at 4:30 each morning. Ruth hauled water from the spring, a quarter-mile walk down a steep path that became treacherous with ice from November through March. She lit fires in both the cook stove and the heating stove, prepared breakfast for the Spurlock family, fed the chickens and pigs, and milked the 2 dairy cows. Only after these tasks could she eat whatever remained from the family's meal. Edith Spurlock supervised Ruth's work with meticulous attention to detail. The floors must be swept twice daily. The dish towels must be boiled every Monday. The twin boys, Thomas and James, ages 3 when Ruth arrived, required constant monitoring because Edith claimed her weak constitution prevented her from chasing active toddlers. Ruth became their shadow, preventing them from wandering into the storage areas, keeping them entertained during long store hours, and changing soiled clothing while Edith managed the ledger books. The twins learned quickly that Ruth existed to serve them. They demanded food between meals, through tantrums that Ruth was expected to soothe without disturbing the store's customers, and reported any perceived slight to their mother. Edith responded to these reports with swift punishment, usually involving withheld meals or additional chores assigned after dark. Hiram Spurlock spoke to Ruth only to issue instructions or corrections. He monitored her work through silent observation, appearing without warning to inspect the livestock pens or examine the kitchen for cleanliness. His presence carried implicit threat. When Ruth failed to meet his standards, he deducted the cost of wasted supplies from Opal's quarterly payment, a practice documented in his meticulous ledgers where Ruth's mistakes appeared as financial losses. During her first months at the trading post, Ruth attempted to write letters to her mother. She composed them mentally while hauling water or feeding livestock, then borrowed paper and pencil from the store's inventory when Edith wasn't watching. The letters described her living conditions, her exhaustion, her isolation. She asked when she might visit home. She begged her mother to reconsider the arrangement. Hiram intercepted every letter. Ruth discovered this during her 3rd month, when she found her own correspondence in Hiram's desk drawer, unopened and bundled with twine. Confronted, Hiram explained calmly that the contract gave him authority over all communications. He informed Ruth that her mother had specifically requested no letters be forwarded, claiming that backward-looking causes unnecessary upset for everyone involved. The quarterly payments to Opal continued arriving on schedule. Ruth knew this because Hiram kept the receipts filed prominently, where she would see them during her cleaning duties. Each receipt represented proof that her mother knew exactly where Ruth was, understood the terms of her servitude, and chose to accept payment rather than demand her daughter's return. By Ruth's 13th birthday in November 1928, she understood that escape was impossible. The trading post sat too far from any town for a child to reach on foot. The surrounding families all did business with the Spurlocks and would return any runaway immediately. The contract bound her legally until age 18, 6 years away. She had become a ghost in her own life, trapped in a valley where even her screams would echo only against indifferent mountains. Throughout 1929 and into 1930, Ruth existed in a silence broken only by the demands of her labor. No letters arrived from Blackberry Hollow. No messages came with the mail carrier. When seasonal timber workers stopped at the trading post for supplies, Ruth listened desperately for any mention of the Pruitt household, any news that might connect her to the family she'd been torn from. In October 1929, a timber crew working contracts near Cooperton Mountain included a man who recognized the name Pruitt. During his transaction at the store, he mentioned that Vernon's operation had expanded significantly, now employing 8 men and acquiring a second team of mules. The twins, he noted, were thriving boys who accompanied their father to the work sites. Vernon's wife had delivered them safely and recovered well. Ruth absorbed this information while scrubbing floors in the adjacent room. Her mother was healthy. The household was prospering. No one had mentioned Ruth's absence or asked about her welfare. She had been erased so completely that even casual conversation about her former family proceeded as though she had never existed. The quarterly payments continued with mechanical regularity. Hiram recorded each transaction in his ledger, $12 every 3 months deposited to Opal's account at the Pikeville banking house. The precision of these payments told Ruth everything she needed to know. Her mother tracked the arrangement carefully enough to collect the money, but showed no interest in the girl generating that income. Winter brought a traveling preacher who held services in the trading post's main room once monthly. Families from surrounding hollows gathered for these occasions, one of the few social events in the isolated region. Ruth served coffee and cornbread to attendees while listening to conversations that revealed the interconnected nature of mountain communities. Everyone knew everyone's business. Everyone understood which families struggled and which prospered. No one ever asked about the girl living in the Spurlock's storage shed. During one such gathering in January 1930, Ruth overheard 2 women discussing Opal Pruitt. The conversation praised Opal's management of such a large household, marveling at how she stretched resources to feed Vernon's boys, plus the twins. One woman mentioned that Opal had recently acquired a new cook stove, a significant purchase that demonstrated the family's improving circumstances. Ruth understood then that the payments she generated were being spent on conveniences for the family that had discarded her. Her labor purchased comfort for people who had chosen to forget she existed. The seasonal rhythms continued: spring planting, summer harvests, autumn preparations for winter. Then the brutal cold months when isolation became absolute. Ruth grew taller, stronger, more efficient in her work. She learned to anticipate the Spurlock family's needs before being told, to move through her duties with minimum interaction, to make herself as invisible as possible while remaining constantly available. The twins, now 5 years old, treated Ruth with casual cruelty learned from observing their parents. They threw food they disliked directly onto the floor, knowing Ruth would clean it. They demanded stories and songs, then complained loudly if Ruth's voice annoyed them. They existed in a world where other people served their wishes without question, and Ruth represented the lowest tier of that hierarchy. By her 14th birthday, Ruth had stopped imagining rescue. She had stopped composing mental letters to her mother. She had accepted that Opal Pruitt had made a permanent choice, prioritizing the comfort of her new family over the welfare of a daughter who reminded her too much of a dead husband and a harder life. But acceptance did not mean surrender. Deep in Ruth's mind, where the Spurlocks could not reach, something harder than mountain stone was forming. Not hope, exactly. Something darker and more dangerous. The patience to wait for opportunity. The conversation that changed everything occurred on a December evening in 1931. Ruth was cleaning the storage room behind the main store when voices drifted through the thin walls. Hiram and Edith were discussing their nephew Dalton, who managed timber contracts in the deeper mountains near the Virginia border. Dalton Spurlock was 26 years old and looking for a wife. Ruth pressed herself against the wall, listening as Hiram explained his proposal. Dalton needed someone capable of hard work, someone accustomed to isolation and difficult conditions. He operated a logging camp 20 miles from the nearest town, a place where a woman would need to cook for crew members, maintain the camp, and manage without complaint during months when weather prevented travel. The Kincaid girl would suit him perfectly, Hiram said. She's strong, trained to domestic work, and has nowhere else to go. Edith's response chilled Ruth to her core. She'll be 16 in November, old enough, and it solves our problem. The boys are starting school next year. We won't need her underfoot constantly. The discussion continued with the same transactional language that had governed Ruth's life since arriving at the trading post. Hiram suggested offering Dalton a reduced bride price since Ruth came with no family dowry and questionable lineage. Edith proposed that Dalton could take Ruth on trial for 6 months to ensure she met his standards before finalizing any permanent arrangement. They were negotiating Ruth's transfer as though she were livestock being sold to a new owner. Dalton Spurlock visited the trading post 3 weeks later. Ruth observed him from the kitchen while preparing the evening meal. He was a large man, thick through the shoulders from years of timber work, with hands scarred from axe and saw blade. He spoke little, communicating mostly through grunts and nods. When Hiram introduced Ruth as the girl we discussed, Dalton examined her the way he might evaluate a work mule, checking her teeth, testing the strength of her hands, asking about her capacity for heavy labor. Ruth kept her eyes downcast and answered when required. Inside, she calculated distances and possibilities. That night, lying on her mattress in the storage shed, Ruth listened to continued conversation between Hiram and Dalton. The men discussed terms. Dalton would take Ruth in March, after winter weather cleared enough for mountain travel. He would pay the Spurlocks $25 for her, a fee that compensated them for 3 years of training and maintenance. Once at the logging camp, Ruth would work as camp cook and eventually as Dalton's wife, bearing children who would inherit his timber contracts. No one asked Ruth if she agreed to this future. No one suggested she had any choice in the matter. The contract, mother signed in 1928, had established Ruth as property that could be transferred between owners according to their needs and negotiations. But Ruth was no longer the frightened 12-year-old who had arrived in a wagon 3 years earlier. She had survived brutal cold, endless labor, and the systematic destruction of her identity. She had learned to move silently, to observe without being noticed, to understand the rhythms and vulnerabilities of the household that imprisoned her. She had also learned the terrain. 3 years of hauling water from the spring, feeding livestock in distant pens, and maintaining the property had taught her every path, every shortcut, every route that connected the trading post to the wider world beyond. Hiram kept his cash box in the bottom drawer of his desk, locked with a key he carried on a chain. Edith stored travel supplies in the pantry, including dried meat, hardtack, and preserved fruit meant for emergency provisions. The wagon mules were kept in the barn nearest the main road. Ruth began making plans. She had 4 months before Dalton Spurlock would arrive to claim his purchase. 4 months to prepare for the only choice she had left: escape. Ruth chose February for her escape because winter storms made the mountain roads nearly impassable. Hiram would assume she couldn't survive the journey. That cold and distance would drive her back before she reached anywhere that mattered. That assumption would give her precious hours before they organized pursuit. She prepared with methodical care. Over 3 months, she stole small amounts from Edith's pantry supplies, hiding dried apples, jerked beef, and hardtack in a canvas bag beneath her mattress. She took one item at a time, spacing thefts weeks apart, so inventory losses would seem like normal spoilage. She also stole a wool blanket from the storage room, replacing it with a threadbare substitute she found in the rag pile. The knife came from the kitchen, a paring blade small enough to conceal, but sharp enough to defend herself if needed. She hid it wrapped in cloth at the bottom of her supply bag. The cache proved more difficult. Hiram kept the lockbox key on his person during waking hours, but at night he hung his trousers on a peg beside the bed he shared with Edith. Ruth had observed this routine for 3 years. On the night of February 9th, 1932, she waited until the house fell silent, then crept through the darkness into the Spurlock's bedroom. Her hands shook as she lifted the key from Hiram's trouser pocket. The metal felt burning cold against her palm. She moved to the main room, unlocked the cash box, and removed 3 $1 bills from the interior. She considered taking more, but knew that larger losses would trigger immediate alarm. $3 might be dismissed as a counting error. More would guarantee swift pursuit. She locked the box, returned the key, and retreated to the storage shed. Sleep was impossible. She lay on her mattress listening to her own heartbeat, knowing that dawn would bring either freedom or punishment beyond anything she'd yet endured. The ice storm struck before sunrise, exactly as the weather patterns she'd studied for 3 years had suggested it might. Freezing rain coated every surface with treacherous glaze, the sound of breaking branches echoing through the valley. Hiram would not check his trap lines in such conditions. The family would remain indoors, focused on keeping fires burning and avoiding injury from falling ice. Ruth dressed in every piece of clothing she owned, layering her 2 dresses over wool stockings and undergarments. She wrapped the blanket around her shoulders, tucked the supply bag under her arm, and slipped from the storage shed while the family ate breakfast. The railroad town of Prestonsburg lay 40 miles northeast. Ruth had memorized the route from conversations overheard in the trading post, piecing together landmarks and distances mentioned by travelers. She would follow the main wagon road until it intersected with the creek path, then track the creek northeast toward lower elevations, where settlements became more frequent. The ice made walking treacherous. Within an hour, Ruth's feet were numb despite her shoes, her hands raw from catching herself during falls. The cold penetrated her layers of clothing, settling into her bones with brutal efficiency. She focused on putting distance between herself and the trading post, counting steps to measure progress, when landmarks disappeared into freezing fog. Near midday, she discovered an abandoned hunting camp, a lean-to structure built against a rock outcropping. She sheltered there long enough to eat a handful of dried apples and rest her burning legs. The temptation to stay was overwhelming, but she knew that stopping meant freezing. Motion generated the only warmth she could create. By nightfall, she had covered perhaps 12 miles. She found another shelter, this time a hollow beneath a fallen oak, and burrowed into the space with her blanket wrapped tight. The temperature dropped viciously after dark. Ruth pressed herself against the frozen earth and tried not to think about the miles still ahead. On the second day, her supplies ran dangerously low. On the third, she encountered a traveling preacher driving a wagon toward Prestonsburg. He asked no questions, simply gestured for her to climb aboard. Ruth had escaped. The preacher left Ruth at the edge of Prestonsburg without asking her name or destination. She stood on the muddy street watching his wagon disappear, then walked toward the center of town with no plan beyond finding work and staying invisible. Prestonsburg in 1932 was a railroad town of approximately 3,000 residents, large enough to offer anonymity, but small enough that a ragged 15-year-old girl attracted attention. Ruth kept her head down, moving through alleys and side streets until she found the commercial district where boarding houses advertised rooms for rent. The third establishment she approached bore a painted sign reading, "Dunaway House." Clean rooms, respectable lodgers. The building stood 3 stories tall, freshly whitewashed, with window boxes that would hold flowers come spring. Ruth hesitated at the entrance, aware of her filthy clothing and desperate appearance, then knocked before courage failed her. The woman who answered was perhaps 40 years old, dressed in practical work clothes, with gray threading through her dark hair. She examined Ruth with shrewd but not unkind eyes, taking in the layered dresses, the mud-caked shoes, the exhaustion that made Ruth sway where she stood. "You running from something or toward something?" the woman asked. "Both," Ruth answered, because lies seemed pointless. The woman introduced herself as Iris Dunaway, widow and proprietor. She offered Ruth a basin of hot water, a bowl of soup, and a basement room, in exchange for daily work maintaining the boarding house. Ruth accepted before Iris could reconsider, scrubbing floors and washing linens with desperate efficiency to prove her value. For 3 weeks, Ruth existed in cautious silence. She learned the rhythms of the boarding house, the personalities of long-term lodgers, the commercial patterns of a town connected to the wider world by railroad and telegraph. She hoarded her 3 stolen dollars, sleeping with the bills tucked into her undergarments, terrified that Hiram Spurlock would somehow trace her to Prestonsburg. Iris watched this silent, haunted girl with growing concern. Finally, on a March evening while they folded laundry in the basement, Iris asked directly what Ruth was hiding from. The words came slowly at first, then faster, the whole terrible story pouring out in the dim lamplight. The contract, the trading post, the intercepted letters, the planned marriage to Dalton Spurlock. Ruth spoke until her voice went hoarse, revealing details she'd had no one to tell for nearly 4 years. Iris listened without interruption. When Ruth finished, the older woman sat quiet for a long moment before speaking. "There's a legal aid society in Lexington," Iris said finally. "They handle cases involving child welfare. I'll write to them." The response arrived 6 weeks later. Attorney Malcolm Hurst traveled from Lexington to interview Ruth personally, taking detailed notes about dates, locations, and the contract terms. His investigation extended beyond Ruth's case, examining court records and conducting interviews throughout Pike County. What he discovered shattered any remaining hope that Ruth's situation was unique. Opal Pruitt had signed similar domestic service contracts for 2 other families in the region. The children involved were daughters from Opal's extended family, girls orphaned or born to struggling relatives who had turned to Opal for help. Instead of providing shelter, Opal had brokered arrangements identical to Ruth's, collecting quarterly payments while placing children into households that needed unpaid labor. Ruth was not her mother's only victim. She was part of a systematic trade in unwanted children, transactions that Opal conducted with the efficiency of someone running a profitable business. Court records showed payments flowing into Opal's account from multiple sources, small amounts that accumulated into significant income, supplementing Vernon's timber earnings. The revelation broke something fundamental in Ruth's understanding of her own past. Her mother had not made one desperate choice during a moment of overwhelming poverty. Opal Pruitt had discovered a reliable method of generating income from children nobody else wanted, and she had exploited that method repeatedly. Malcolm Hurst promised Ruth he would pursue prosecution. He would force Pike County authorities to acknowledge that these contracts violated child labor laws. He would make Opal Pruitt face consequences for systematically trafficking children. But first, he needed Ruth to confront her mother in court. The Pike County Courthouse in Pikeville held preliminary hearings on May 12, 1932. Malcolm Hurst had filed formal complaints against Opal Pruitt, Hiram, and Edith Spurlock, and 2 other families involved in similar arrangements. The charges included child labor violations, unlawful indenture, and conspiracy to exploit minors through fraudulent contracts. Ruth sat beside Iris Dunaway in the gallery, wearing a borrowed dress that actually fit her properly for the first time in 4 years. She watched the courtroom fill with spectators, lawyers, and county officials, all gathered to determine whether children could be legally traded like livestock in eastern Kentucky. Opal Pruitt entered through the main doors, accompanied by Vernon and his 3 sons. She wore her Sunday dress, her hair pinned neatly beneath a respectable hat. She looked prosperous, healthy, utterly composed. When her eyes met Ruth's across the courtroom, no recognition flickered there. No shame. No regret. She simply looked away, as though Ruth were a stranger whose presence held no significance. The preliminary arguments revealed the fundamental problem immediately. Kentucky law in 1932 contained provisions against child labor in factories and mines, but remained vague regarding domestic service arrangements within private households. The contracts Opal had signed technically fell within legal gray areas that local courts had never been forced to examine. The county prosecutor, a man named Dalton Reeves, who handled criminal cases for Pike County, argued that the state lacked jurisdiction over family agreements made voluntarily between consenting parties. Opal Pruitt, he stated, had exercised her legal authority as parent to place her children in situations she deemed appropriate. The families receiving the children had provided shelter, food, and moral instruction as promised. Malcolm Hurst countered with documentation of Ruth's living conditions, the intercepted letters, the planned forced marriage to Dalton Spurlock. He presented testimony from Iris Dunaway, describing Ruth's physical and emotional state upon arrival in Prestonsburg. He argued that the contracts represented human trafficking, disguised as domestic placement. The judge, a 60-year-old named Thomas Caldwell, who had presided over Pike County courts since 1918, listened with visible discomfort. When testimony concluded, he called for a brief recess before delivering his preliminary ruling. Ruth was summoned to the judge's chambers, along with Malcolm Hurst and the prosecutor. Opal Pruitt was brought in separately. For the first time in 4 years, Ruth stood face to face with her mother in a space small enough that neither could avoid the other's presence. Judge Caldwell asked Opal directly whether she understood the conditions under which Ruth had lived at the Spurlock trading post. Opal's response was delivered without emotion or hesitation. "I done what needed doing to feed the living children under my roof," she said. "Ruth was old enough to work. The Spurlocks needed help. The arrangement suited everyone involved. Your daughter was 12 years old, Malcolm Hurst said. She was fed and sheltered, Opal replied. That's more than some children get. The judge asked Ruth if she had been physically harmed or beaten during her time with the Spurlocks. Ruth answered honestly that she had not been struck, though she described the cold storage shed, the endless labor, the isolation. Sounds like farm life to me, Opal said. Ain't nothing Ruth experienced that every mountain child don't face. Judge Caldwell delivered his ruling that afternoon. The contracts, while morally questionable, did not violate specific statutes under Kentucky law as written. The families involved had technically provided the care promised in the agreements. Most critically, the matter involved private family arrangements that fell outside clear county jurisdiction. The case was dismissed. Malcolm Hurst filed immediate appeals, but the legal battle would take years to resolve through higher courts. Meanwhile, Opal Pruitt walked from the courthouse a free woman, her quarterly payments from the Spurlocks protected by the same contract that had enslaved Ruth. Outside on the courthouse steps, Ruth watched her mother climb into Vernon's wagon. Opal never looked back. She simply took her seat beside her husband and rode away toward Blackberry Hollow, returning to the life she had built with money earned by selling her daughter. Ruth understood then that justice was a luxury afforded only to those whose suffering could be neatly categorized within existing laws. For children like her, trapped in arrangements that technically provided food and shelter while destroying everything else, the legal system offered no protection. She would have to build her own life from nothing, carrying the knowledge that the woman who gave her birth had valued her at $12 per quarter and felt no shame in that calculation. Ruth Kincaid never returned to Blackberry Hollow. She never spoke to her mother again. The legal battle that Malcolm Hurst continued to wage through appeals eventually stalled in circuit courts that refused to challenge established practices regarding parental authority and domestic labor. By 1934, the case had been quietly abandoned, buried in legal archives, alongside countless other failures to protect vulnerable children. Ruth remained in Prestonsburg, working for Iris Dunaway until she turned 18. The boarding house became the closest thing to home she had known since her father's death. Iris taught her proper bookkeeping, how to manage household accounts, how to navigate the world beyond isolated mountain hollows. More importantly, Iris provided something Ruth had been denied for 4 years: the simple dignity of being treated as a person rather than property. In 1936, Ruth met Theodore Bassett, a railroad clerk who handled freight logistics for the Chesapeake and Ohio Railway. Theodore was 23, quiet, methodical in his work, and possessed of a fundamental decency that Ruth had learned not to take for granted. Their courtship proceeded slowly, carefully, two cautious people learning to trust. They married in November 1936 at the Prestonsburg Methodist Church, with Iris Dunaway standing as witness. The marriage produced 4 children between 1937 and 1944. 2 daughters and 2 sons, who grew up knowing nothing of their mother's childhood except that she came from the mountains and preferred not to discuss the past. Ruth raised them with fierce protectiveness, ensuring they received education, proper medical care, and the absolute certainty that they were valued beyond measure. She never spoke Opal Pruitt's name in their presence. Theodore Bassett died in 1971 from complications following a stroke. Ruth remained in the house they had built together on Prestonsburg's east side, maintaining her garden and attending church regularly until her own health failed in the early 1980s. She passed away on March 17, 1983, at age 67, surrounded by her children and grandchildren. Her family discovered the diaries 3 weeks later while sorting through her belongings. 6 leather-bound journals, dating from 1951 through 1982, filled with meticulous documentation of the 3 years she spent at the Spurlock trading post and the events that followed. The entries were neither angry nor self-pitying. Ruth wrote with the precision of someone creating historical record, documenting dates, names, locations, and the systematic mechanisms through which unwanted children disappeared into servitude throughout Appalachia. She described other cases she had discovered over the years through correspondence with legal aid societies and social workers, evidence suggesting that her experience was far from unique. Her final entry, dated February 9, 1983, exactly 51 years after her escape, addressed the question she had spent a lifetime answering through the way she chose to live. "I was 12 when my mother decided I was worth less than flour and lamp oil," she wrote. "She calculated my value and found it acceptable to trade me for household supplies and $48 per year. That calculation was meant to define me, to reduce my entire existence to a transaction recorded in someone else's ledger. I spent the rest of my life proving her calculation wrong. I raised children who never doubted their worth. I built a home where love was not measured in quarterly payments. I survived, and in surviving, I demonstrated that a child's value cannot be determined by the person who failed to protect them. My mother's shame is hers to carry. I refuse to carry it for her." The diaries were eventually donated to the Kentucky Historical Society, where they remain in the archives alongside other documentation of Appalachian poverty and the children who fell through gaps in social protection. Researchers who have studied Ruth's account note that similar arrangements continued throughout rural Kentucky well into the 1950s. Only ending when improved education, social services, and economic opportunities made such transactions less necessary and more difficult to conceal. Ruth Kincaid's story stands as testimony to a practice most people prefer to forget: that poverty can twist even parental love into something transactional, that children can become commodities when survival demands it, and that justice often arrives too late, or not at all, for those who need it most. If Ruth's story has moved you, if it's made you think about the children who disappeared into arrangements their families orchestrated, then her voice has reached across decades to find you. Click the like button and subscribe to the channel so that these forgotten testimonies continue to be heard. Share this story with someone who needs to understand that survival is its own form of victory, that children who were traded and discarded can still build lives that matter. Ruth Kincaid refused to be erased. The least we can do is remember that she existed, that she mattered, and that her life was worth infinitely more than the price her mother placed on it.